Thank you, Rich. How many people in the room have actually been in a natural disaster? Bernie, Dean Hageman, a few of you. How many of these people were living in a coastal region at the time? You were. And the others, you were, Bernie. And Dean Hageman, where was this?
Puerto Rico.
In Puerto Rico. Well, that's a coastal region, come on. Okay. The focus of this discussion today is going to be a limited number of natural disasters. Primarily, I'm going to be talking about Hurricane Katrina, the tsunami that occurred in the Indian Ocean, and somewhat, but less so, the earthquake that occurred in Pakistan. However, as you know, natural disasters are something that can happen anywhere. Here in Michigan, for example, I would assume there are tornadoes. There certainly are very, very serious snowstorms. Sometimes there's technological disruptions that occur. For example, I think maybe 2 years ago I was here and there was the power grid that was down, so people didn't have electricity or access to the internet. And then there's also the potential of emerging epidemics. We've had some cases of bird flu, for example, in Canada. Not human cases, but we've had some fowl cases in Canada, and that's something that could occur here in Michigan. So really no part of the country, no part of the world is completely immune from the potential of a natural disaster. Secondly, natural disasters do require some type of community response. That can be a very well-organized response, or it can be a response that is not particularly well orchestrated. We're going to talk about some of each of those situations. In all natural disasters, and especially in cases where there's been some level of preparedness and a response, you can count on these various domains or these elements to be critical and key to the situation. One, the physical environment. This is everything from transportation systems to housing, business infrastructure, and so forth. The physical environment is usually something that is very severely disrupted in natural disasters. The fiscal environment. These are the financial resources that keep a community or an industry or a city or a town going. There's disruption in this area typically. The medical infrastructure is often disrupted. Sometimes hospitals actually can't be functional during a natural disaster, and there has to be alternative contingencies and so forth. The social environment, everything from schools to churches, people's internal psychological state, emotional well-being, and so forth is altered during this type of situation. The cultural environment can be changed and altered. And then the political environment offers many challenges. Just want to give you a few examples from Katrina, for example. The cultural environment in New Orleans. One way in which this was severely challenged was there was a case of a jazz museum that had archived original works of music sheets. And every one of these were destroyed. There was no anticipation this would happen. So that's a very, very central cultural aspect of that city is music and the history of music and the protection of that history. And these museums had not done any preparation for that. And so an awful lot was lost. Another example, it's a blend of, say, the social and the cultural, where post-Katrina, a lot of labor was needed in the reconstruction, and still is, still going on. And it's anticipated that 1 million Hispanic laborers have moved into the New Orleans area, for example. Now, out of 1 million laborers, I would predict that many of them will stay. And we've seen this when temporary labor comes in after disaster, a certain fairly large percentage tend to stay in the area. Well, New Orleans historically has been a French, Cajun, Creole culture. Now with 1 million Hispanics working as temporary labor, many of whom will stay there, that will inevitably change the culture of that city. There's no doubt about it. The political, there's so many examples here where in the case of New Orleans we had a mayor, we had a governor, head of major federal agencies, and a U.S. president, all trying to communicate and all doing different, basically, levels of effectiveness in that communication process. And what the public saw was a glaring need for coordination at these three or four different levels of government. Many will say that that did not work very effectively. In the tsunami case, we saw international organizations coming in to offer relief very quickly, and the federal or the local governments there taking a little more time to do assessments, and the international organizations were doing work that sometimes was counterproductive to what the local governments felt needed to be done. So there was that lack of articulation. And then there are other cases where the federal government simply does not have the resources to respond to something as overwhelming as one of these natural disasters. The earthquake in Pakistan, for example. In fact, go forward. The earthquake in Pakistan is an example where currently there are 80,000 people who are still homeless. And it's winter there. And we know that there's high incidences of flu and malnutrition, and people simply dying from being cold, lack of shelter. The local governments just, in that case, just simply does not have the resources to respond. In tsunami, we've seen, initially there was, I think the latest count, 200,000 deaths and still 100,000 homeless in that area, and 30 or 40,000 misplaced, people that simply haven't been located. And then in Katrina, we saw anywhere from 1,000, about over 1,000 deaths in that case, and still hundreds of thousands of people displaced. Some of these people may not even return to that locale. They may stay in distant cities and so forth. So again, the local governments and in some of these cases the federal governments are not resourced to respond effectively. Now, as mentioned in my opening comment, the issues and the concerns and the likelihood of natural disasters simply not going to go away. We see an increase of development in coastal areas. We see an increase of development in seismic faults, floodplains, and even wilderness. In wilderness, we have a number of cases of wildfires and mudslides. Floodplains, we saw what happened with the levees in New Orleans. We certainly saw what happened in the coastal regions in the tsunami region. And seismic faults, these sometimes can include very large cities like San Francisco or Memphis, Tennessee. Actually, even New York, there's a seismic fault under New York City. Increased threat of terrorism, something that's not likely to go away in the foreseeable future. We don't really know what the nature of the next terrorist event will be. We have seen primarily urban cases in Madrid, New York City, London, but potentially an event could occur that is much more systemic, much more broad in its impact. Increased dependence on technology, the internet, the power grid, water purification, and so forth make us much more vulnerable to disaster. increased importation of goods and labor, the likelihood of bringing in a pathogen, an infectious agent, a toxic agent, or even that linking with terrorism to increase the likelihood of disaster. Rapid global transportation and newly emerging diseases. We are indeed a global village. Any one of us within hours could be in another country. The screening that occurs at the borders is really not very thorough, and it can't be. Not with the amount of goods and people and traffic that occurs between the borders. Again, this increases the likelihood of some potential disaster. How do communities plan? There's agent-specific planning, and this is most common. Communities, say in a coastal region, will plan for hurricane disaster. And they have community-based plans, they have contingencies, they have simulations, they have exercises and so forth for a particular event. Coastal region, it's usually going to be a hurricane. San Francisco, potentially training and planning for an earthquake, for example. There's also the all hazards approach, and this is really being advocated more by emergency preparedness professionals who say that we really don't have the luxury of predicting what type of disaster is going to occur. We need to be prepared for pretty much anything. And there are elements of disaster that are common among all disasters, whatever the cause is. And there are human responses to disaster that are fairly common as well. And thus the all hazards approach is probably being it actually is being much more advocated now than the agent-specific approaches that we've seen in the past. New Orleans would be a good case where an agent-specific planning approach was used, and that was for hurricane. There really wasn't a lot of planning done for flooding. You know, there's post-hurricane flooding, which is the type of flooding that comes and recedes very quickly. And then there's the kind of flooding that occurred with the levee break, and that really was not thoroughly prepared for. Same with the tsunami incidents. There were some early warnings about a tsunami because an earthquake had occurred, and people along the coastal regions in the Indian Ocean had already felt the impact of the earthquake. Some buildings were down. People actually were knocked down in the streets because they couldn't stand and so forth. But there was no warning, and earthquakes come that way. And then only very few people realize, well, if there's an earthquake out in the ocean, then there's going to be a wave. And a warning was sent out from a seismic monitoring center in Hawaii, actually to Thailand. And the warning arrived 10 minutes prior to the wave's arrival. So very short-term warning there. Common tasks. Now these tasks, if you're taking an all hazards approach, for example, or even an agent-specific approach, you would still use every one of these. There still will be a need for inter-organizational coordination. You cannot, in this world, there's no single entity, no organization, no FEMA, whatever, that is capable of doing everything. This is a book I just wanted to circulate that Mike Kennedy, myself, and others did that addresses the issue of community organizations, and that's specific to terrorism, but terrorism is one type of disaster that it can occur, and you see the interorganizational coordination as identified in that book to be relevant regardless of the type of disaster. When I went to the coast and did some relief work right after Katrina hit, and then again this past Thanksgiving, what I saw most and what I was most impressed by were the number of churches, the number of non-governmental organizations, volunteer organizations, hospitals, many, many, many non-government entities, universities, that had sent teams and groups of people down to work. I was very impressed by that. What I was underwhelmed by, though, was the amount of coordination between them. There were people kind of stepping and tripping over each other. We would see large amounts of supplies that were provided, but no means for distribution. We saw that in the tsunami area, too. Piles and piles and piles of clothing. People were sending things like wool sweaters and heavy winter clothes and so forth, and there was no use for them. This is the Indian Ocean. It's a warm area. People actually don't wear many clothes. They don't need heavy clothing. And so piles of clothing was just sitting there going to waste. Or kinds of food that people could not use, or medications that were not usable, those kinds of things. So there was a tremendous lack of coordination in all three of these. This was not anything unique to Katrina. Every natural disaster I've ever read about, seen, or studied, there's been a greater need for interorganizational coordination. Resource management, there's always a need for funding, and the funding needs typically exceed that which is already at hand. Very few cities, very few communities have a big bank or contingency of money that is there for a natural disaster. They effectively depend on the kindness of others. And this will come in the form of the Red Cross. It will come through the federal governments. It will come through all kinds of donor organizations and sometimes philanthropists and fundraisers, celebrities that go and raise funds and so forth. That is the acquisition of resources, and then there's a great need for the redistribution of those resources in an effective way. Warnings and evacuation. People typically, the public typically undervalue or underrate warnings. They usually ignore them. They feel like the risk is not as severe as what it actually could be. So warnings are something that have to be repeated over and over and over and over. And evacuations, unfortunately or not, sometimes have to be mandated. People are not very quick to evacuate their home. There's something within the human psyche that tells us we need to stay and protect our home or our property. Sometimes that's very foolish, though. Search and rescue efforts, always a critical element. People are dispersed, people are hurt, people are injured. They need to be found, they need to be identified, they need to be taken to medical facilities. This indeed is where federal, whether it be Pakistan, Thailand, United States, federal resources are very important. In Katrina we saw Coast Guard, National Guard, and so forth on the scene pretty quickly for this purpose. Working with media, we're a very media-intensive world. People have sort of a love-hate relationship with the media. They put a lot of stock in what the media say, and then they also discount what the media says. So we have to be aware of that in any type of disaster planning. But regardless, we do have to articulate with the media, and the media can become our best resource for getting the word out, whether it be about warnings, evacuation, availability of resources, where to go, when, and so forth. Triage and casualty distribution. Most of you are health professionals. This is pretty self-evident. It's interesting that in one type of disaster we haven't really seen, which would be, say, a nuclear event, we have what's called inverse triage. Typically in these natural disasters, people who are brought to the medical centers first are people who are injured. And then secondly will be people who already had some type of medical condition and they need, say, medication or they need follow-up care. In a nuclear event, you see what's called an inverse triage, and the first people who arrive at your medical facilities are the ones that are typically in least need of care, because they're the ones who are able to get there. And then in the zone that is the zone of impact, in the contaminated area, will remain lots of other people who are not evacuated immediately but much later. So again, it's a hypothetical. We haven't had to deal with it here, but it's something that should be part of the plan. And when we're talking about triage and casualty distribution, that's when we do need to be sort of agent specific about the type of disaster we're looking at. Patient care and infrastructure, you can count on the infrastructure being disrupted. In New Orleans, Tulane University Hospital, for example, had its generators in the basement. The basements were flooded, the generators went down, no power, so no backup power. It's very hard to do surgery without electricity, but it was done, and done anyway. Patient and refugee tracking. I haven't seen in Pakistan nor in the tsunami region where this was done very effectively. In the U.S., there have been pretty good attempts at this using simple note cards and then the internet. Those have been most helpful in patient and refugee tracking. And once again, the media has been helpful too in this. Management of volunteers and donations. You have lots of people coming in who want to help. They don't know how to help. They don't know what to do. They need an assignment. You need to give people a very specific assignment. That may be distribution, that may be cooking, that may be cleanup, that may be security, or what have you. But people need a specific assignment, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of duplication of effort, or you're going to have very frustrated volunteers. Oh, I went down there to help, but they had nothing for me to do. Likewise with donations. And then the last item I call organized improvisation. And that is, you have to simply be ready to do whatever, whenever. You have to become very creative when you're working in a disaster relief area. And I have some slides from my trip down, and I'll talk a little bit more about organized improvisation. Some people would say that a plan, we know with strategic plans, we know with facility planning and so forth, sometimes a plan is something that just goes into a file and collects dust, and that's very unfortunate. Disaster plans are the same way. Everybody does them. Almost every community has done this exercise. Certainly large cities have. And, but many of them don't place much importance on it. The plan is done and it's set aside. It's extremely important. Training is very important as well, and this has to be multi-organizational. You can't have training within the police department and then training in the public health department and then training in the schools, and each of them are doing something somewhat different. It has to be inter-organizational, because at the disaster time they're going to have to work together, and they can't be working in silos or segmented ways. The importance of drills and simulations, and these need to be multi-jurisdictional, which means local, federal, state, county, because the disaster crosses lines and borders. And then at least every 12 months there needs to be a review of the plan, there needs to be a simulation, there needs to be further training. Now, I just want to show you, I'll try to use this. Nope, that goes backwards. Anyone know how to work this thing? It's a remote. Yeah, I don't want to have to walk over to I need to go forward with it. The left click is forward? Okay. I helped a group set up a temporary mobile hospital unit. This was actually nearly 3 months after the hurricane had hit. There had been some others set up early on. For example, Carolinas Medical Center, a colleague who teaches in our program participated in that. They took $1 million mobile center down and set it up, and it stayed there for about 2 months. This is what came later, though, because a lot of the big organizations were in there for 30 to 60 days and then left. But the second time I went down to Waveland, I saw no federal, I saw no troops, I saw no FEMA people, I saw very little government activity. What I saw remaining were volunteer organizations. And this is an example. And you can see within the clinic we had to have internet access. So this was our communication center. And because it's November, it was starting, even in Mississippi, it was starting to get cool, at least at night. So we had to have heating. Patients had to be warm. And you can see the temporary storage of supplies. And this was being run off of a generator. Okay, near that tent, which was a medical tent, there was also basically a cyber cafe. And this was to allow people in the community to come in and check email. Because email, as I mentioned earlier, is a means of communicating with people who have moved on, who are no longer in the area. They've gone on to Dallas or Houston or to Shreveport or to another city. It's also a way of keeping up with what's happening in the media. That is the mobile hospital. So very small. I think I might have skipped a slide. There was also volunteer kitchens, and you can see we had to cook. I obviously didn't cook, but they had to cook food that was, first of all, made from whatever was donated, and secondly, that was reasonably nutritious, high protein, and so forth. So this is a mixture of eggs, onions, and tomatoes, I think. And the volunteers here were a group called the Rainbow Children out of Colorado, and they came and they set up a large kitchen and a serving tent. They served 3,000 citizens and volunteers a day. That's back to the medical tent. This is a secondary tent that was set up for medical supplies. That's inside the serving tent. This was a system that was used to identify houses. This was what, no, it's nothing left, but this is what once was a house. And property owners, and if not property owners, city officials were asked to identify the house number and the name, and to put it on any object that would stand. And this was written on a door so that you could see this was house number 326 on that particular street. Also, state, county, federal, local officials did different inspections. Some were for health purposes, some were structural and safety, and then they would post the inspections on each property. So people who would come later or the homeowner could realize that there's a particular risk or danger in that property. This far exceeds what we saw in the tsunami region, for example. None of this has been done yet there. Again, more of the home identification. It's 3 months after the event. That's the extent of what was done. That's just, I'm just standing there in the debris. could see a lot of personal loss. People have a process of grieving and feeling of loss that they go through after these disasters. Now, FEMA did provide trailers. You can see two of them, the white trailers, for homeowners who lost their homes. And so they would bring them in and set them up. And preferably it would be on the home site. There were other instances where the trailers were set up in large lots, say 2,000 at a time. And that was done in more urban areas like New Orleans. Waveland is a small town, so FEMA was able to set the trailers up on the lots. Some of them had power, some of them did not. In this case, there was a power line connecting a whole stream of trailers. In other cases, individuals had generators. In other cases, they lived in them without power. There were also some tragedies. This family had received this trailer one day. Next night, it caught on fire. And it was just faulty electrical system. So then no one was injured, but they lost that. There's going to be a 2-week waiting period for another one. A lot of people do preparation by building a structure that's going to withstand the disaster. This was a hurricane-proof house. The structural engineers, architects said use the steel I-beams. Well, the steel I-beams are there, but everything else was gone. So, and then you can see they had to move into the FEMA trailer too. See how high the seawater came? That's seaweed. Churches, I didn't see a single church that survived along that coastal region. And even the churches had to innovate. So this particular church set up a tent so they could continue to have services. The building was gone, but the steeple, which I'm told the steeple was on top of it, and it just fell straight down and set right there. Everything else was gone. Amazing. People would lose not just their home, but their automobile, and in this case, they lost their home, their automobile, and their job. And they were doubtful whether they would ever return. So you can see again, social, economic, physical, all of those. And then a cultural change because these individuals contributed to the local culture. They had been there for many, many years. They were part of the local community, and now they left and they probably will not return. Transportation, I'd mentioned this was a road along Bay St. Louis, which is a small town. And this road was this way for miles and miles. Businesses were disrupted. As you know, in any coastal region, entertainment, bars, saloons, very important part of the local culture. And there was a lot of innovation. That bar, that saloon, the guy set up across the street as best he could this way. A house, automobiles. I think there were over 100,000 automobiles that were destroyed. And this is an example of this was a large church-sponsored supply tent. And volunteers or victims of the disaster could come in and just take what they needed. But it was well organized. You'd come in and had to kind of account for what you were getting, but it was all done at no charge. And this slide I'm just going to leave up, but you can read it on your own. It's written by scientist and writer Robert Heinlein. He's not talking about disaster, but basically in a disaster setting, you have to be multi-skilled, multifunctional. You as an individual, your organization, your community, all require a tremendous amount of innovation, a tremendous amount of collaboration, a tremendous amount of ability to be, again, multi-skilled and multi-directional in addressing these problems and issues. So we'll use the rest of the time to engage in a dialogue or discussion.
Okay, this presentation is open for comments or questions.
Yeah. And so Dr. Parr has a microphone that you...
Thank you.
Okay.
Don't you feel prevention is better than
Anybody
cure?
else?
There's a statement made everywhere throughout the world in globe.
Yes.
So US is supposed to be the richest country, the maximum resources, and compared to any other developed countries, that's what they say. Okay, so don't you feel that before they should be prepared for disaster? And if they're really prepared, this Katrina would not have hit us so much. We would not have been lost. I think they're spending more money in not developing resources to find out whether they're going to get hit by a hurricane at a long duration so that they can prepare, they can evacuate people, everything could be. And why there should be a house which is going to collapse with a hurricane when these people have that much resources to build a heavy house?
Right. No, I agree 100%. Prevention,
See, because all these things are theory. Nobody is putting it into practice. We
Yeah.
just talk, we have to make disaster management, we have to do this, we have to do that. But are we doing it? If we would have done it, we would not have faced the Katrina stage at all.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Yeah. No, prevention definitely is preferable to cure. It's done and it's not done, what you're saying. In '89, I worked in Hurricane Hugo relief, which was in Charleston, South Carolina. Every house that was built after that had upgraded codes to make them hurricane resistant. Nothing's hurricane proof. And the house we lived in actually not only had the steel I-beams, but the ground level, no living space could exist on the ground level. So a tsunami, a tidal wave of up to about 10 feet or so would go under the house. It had breakaway walls. And then the upper structure was much, much, much stronger. And some of these have, withstood subsequent hurricanes. So that's done. There has been a great effort to regulate the amount of coastal development, but that's usually met with local resistance. For example, in Biloxi and the Mississippi coast, there was a strong push to not rebuild casinos on the coast. Well, they're being rebuilt. So there's a lot of economic and political force to continue the development of the coastal regions, which makes them more vulnerable. Others are choosing not to do that. Along the Atlantic coast, there are incredible vast stretches of land that are not open to development and never will be. They're protected by the state and different land reserves and so forth. The other form of prevention would be proper planning. Usually communities that have been through this have better plans than communities that haven't. Usually smaller communities plan better than larger communities. I don't know of a case where any community is 100% at where they should be in planning for natural disaster. But yeah, I absolutely agree. Prevention is much better than cure and less costly. And that's true with the individual as well as the community. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When we talk about disaster management, we've been thinking about after the disaster is hitting us, what do we do next? That's what we're talking about. But I think knowing that a disaster is going to hit is more important. See, unlike the US, India didn't have that many resources or the technology to probably identify or even detect that there would be a tsunami. So what extent do you think detecting or expecting a disaster could help in managing it better?
Well, in the case of tsunami, there was no early warning, and the results were devastating. In the case of Katrina, there was an early warning, and the results were devastating. So, even with warning, it's back to what I said earlier about humans, that are going to be resistant to evacuate, resistant to take warnings seriously. Even with early warnings, we still see the impact as tremendous. I don't have an answer as far as how we can make warnings more salient. We do, at least technologically, we do need a better system for tsunamis in particular for early warning. Right now there's a tremendous, wonderfully effective system in the Pacific Ocean. It's based in Hawaii, and that's for California and Latin America and so forth, yeah. But the equivalent did not exist in the Indian Ocean. I think there will be. I think it's going to be located in Sri Lanka, but I'm not sure about that. Another question?
James, I suppose we aren't privy to some of these evaluations, but are there evaluations on disaster plans that shows things that worked and things that didn't? And can you give us some insight on that?
Yeah. Well, training. The disaster plans that have been most effective are the ones where there was training. Not just a plan, but follow-up training and periodic, routine, ongoing training. Not something that was just sporadic that occurred one time. I think, Rich, that's probably the biggest variable right now. The other one is that the plan be interorganizational, multi-jurisdictional. It not simply be a city plan, but it's a city, county, state, federal plan. Those are the two most important variables when we look at planning. And back to the lady's question over here, no, obviously we can't just talk about disaster management, we have to talk about preparedness. The two, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Gary, you had a question?
Yeah, Dr. Johnson, how do you feel about the role of the military in disaster recovery operations? One thing that the military does well is plan large-scale operations of this nature, and there was a big argument in the New Orleans situation about whether or not to use military assets for that on U.S. homeland.
Well, each country is going to be somewhat different on that. Some countries are very reticent to involve military in local affairs. Other countries are not. The U.S. would be one of those that is reticent. It's not part of our of the American way, basically, to involve the U.S. very much in local affairs. So the U.S. is going to be held back somewhat. Now, there are two exceptions to that. One is the Coast Guard and the National Guard. And Coast Guard was very quick on the scene for Katrina. National Guard, less so. But once they arrived, they were pretty effective. As far as, active duty troops, there's usually not going to be a major role. You're asking my opinion, should there be more of a role? No, I don't think so. I prefer it to remain with Coast Guard, National Guard myself. And National Guard ostensibly is under the leadership of the governor and some appointed lead general, in this case, general honoree. And then the Coast Guard is there primarily for search and rescue. That's, if you're just asking a personal opinion, I'm very comfortable with that.
Are there other questions?
I just had a comment, not a question. I was in the area a couple of times, and I was actually in Waveland Bay, St. Louis 3 weeks ago. It still looks exactly the same.
Still looks like that. Yeah.
They don't have near enough time to clean up. However, I can only comment on Katrina in the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and I think when you talk about the different forms of emergency preparedness, the all-hazard had to take over because there was local and state breakdown.
Right.
So when you have particular areas that are gone, when every doctor in the county is gone, then you have to have National Guard, you have to have all-hazard people coming in order to make sense of it all. The problem is that they are not local generally.
No, right.
And so they're not so familiar with the area to begin with. But I think that there was a very much a breakdown from what we saw too.
Oh, yeah.
Many
Yeah.
people working for FEMA were very, very frustrated, and it was just a very, who would have ever imagined in their lifetime that this size disaster would occur?
Yes.
And I think that's why you can't build a house that is 40 feet above the ground to prepare for water.
Right.
And there were some waves in the Gulf Coast that were estimated to be 43 feet.
The primary tidal surge was 30 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, 28 feet, 43 feet,
Yeah.
depending on what area.
Yeah.
I heard different accounts, but
Sure.
you know, 10 feet high house isn't going to help you
No.
much.
No.
So perhaps it is best that we just don't build in those areas.
Well, that's an alternative, would be a different approach to land management or land use management, and not to build in vulnerable areas. Unfortunately, many cities have already been built in vulnerable areas. You know, we need ports, so a port by definition is going to be on a coast, and it's in a vulnerable area, usually low lying, usually floodplain, and often in a hurricane zone. Cities that are already built on seismic faults, big cities, we can't reverse that. So, yeah, our vulnerability is something that we've predetermined in a lot of ways. I know during I think it was the 1918 hurricane that hit Galveston. Galveston was a large, thriving city. That era may be the equivalent of a New Orleans today, probably not quite to that extent. But when the hurricane destroyed that city, people moved upriver to a small town called Houston. Now the small town Houston is the big city. That could happen in New Orleans. Baton Rouge could be, in 30 years, the big city, and New Orleans a beautiful, quaint, kind of tourist port city. That could definitely happen. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Johnson. Thanks for a very interesting and revealing presentation. After a disaster has occurred, I think society and the government can easily see the need for putting resources into the recovery effort. But I think in terms of disaster preparedness and on the prevention side, moving resources towards those efforts is competing against ongoing resource pressures that are occurring everywhere, every day.
True.
How do you convince the citizens and how do you convince the government to actually set aside resources for disaster preparedness and prevention in amongst all of the competition for resources that's always ongoing? And what sort of equation should we be using to sort of balance meeting immediate needs versus anticipated needs, but that we don't know when they're going to actually occur as far as disasters go? Yeah,
well, that's a multi-billion-dollar question. The cost of Katrina is going to potentially exceed $400 billion. Those resources, if they had been put into preparedness, which is impossible, we just don't have that type of expendable resource available, certainly could have had a city with built-up levees, for example, could have had a much better evacuation plan. You know, those things could have been done. In a country as large as ours, with as many vulnerable areas, as large, you know, we have huge coastlines, we have large seismic fault regions, large wilderness regions that are being developed. I don't think there's the money, the monetary resources to do basically what would be ideal. So what we have to do, and because of that, is we have to also rely on business and philanthropy. Many of the resources, at least for response, not so much for preparedness, come from the private sector, not from the government. In matters of preparedness, what I would like to see is, instead of the local government saying it's a federal responsibility and the feds saying it's a state responsibility and everybody's doing this, what I would like to see is much more interagency, multi-jurisdictional coordination so that the resources are not just coming from one place. Many local governments, if the federal government doesn't provide a disaster preparedness block grant, they're not going to do it. They depend almost solely on those federal resources to do the kind of training and so forth that's necessary. And then the local governments will spend their money on local needs like roads or housing or what have you. I don't have an answer. It's just a tremendous, tremendous question that you have, and I would just like to see much more coordination of resources at the three levels of government and strong involvement of the private sector in preparedness, not just response. Private sector responds wonderfully once an event's occurred. Millions, billions of dollars are raised once the event's occurred, but very little's done on the front end. So I would like to see more involvement of the private sector. And the book that's circulating around, we talk about the important role of business in community planning also. And locally, right here, is Diane DeSalvo in the room? Yeah, Diane, right here. Gosh, I was just looking over you the whole time. She may want to just share with you briefly. There's a university-wide committee set up for disaster preparedness. I serve on the committee, Dr. Anungu, and maybe just tell us a little bit, because this is a local effort, if you will, fairly low cost, not waiting for federal grant or anything, but a local effort, meaning university-based, to begin at least the dialogue and some preparation. Any comment about it?
Actually, there's an emergency preparedness committee already on campus for local issues. This is for, I work in study abroad, and this is for emergencies that would happen overseas that we're forming this particular committee. Every conference I go to says it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when something will happen, and it's important that we start talking about this and have a plan and one that we rehearse and we're ready for, and that's what we're working on now.
So if an event happens abroad, then we can begin to assess its impact here on the university. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that organizing and managing volunteers is a big problem in natural disasters.
Mm-hmm.
And personal experience, we tried to get together a group of students, and we did. We had the resources and transportation to go down there, and we found an organization, and we started talking to them months before, and they didn't respond until the day that we were supposed to be down there, that, oh yeah, you guys can come. So we ended up not being able to go. And for the Red Cross, you have to go through a 2-week training program.
That's right.
To even go down there, and that's just not realistic for college students. So what do you think should be done as far as organizing and managing volunteers to go down there? Do you think it should be a government function?
Well, the Red Cross certainly is not a government organization, and they have, after Katrina, they've decided to try to recruit more volunteers before an event occurs. They were overwhelmed with volunteers after Katrina, and they couldn't train them fast enough. Some of their training has to do with liability issues. Some of it has to do with just efficiency, the way they want you to work in the field and so forth. And they do require the 2-week training. But they're reassessing that. They're going to have different levels of training, and not all of it will be 2 weeks, and preferably more people trained before an event occurs. No, the government actually is not the lead agency, if you will, in assignment of volunteers. That's usually something that occurs at the local level. Some volunteer organization that's already there. If you had had the good luck of, say, connecting with a church or a volunteer organization in that area, they would have put you to work right away. I know this group, the Rainbow Children from Colorado, they would love to have had more people that could serve meals and cook. Because they were working 24 hours around the clock, 7 days a week, and some of them were just being exhausted. So government probably would not be a good mechanism for organizing volunteers. It's almost counter to the whole notion. Government has its specific role, and then the volunteer organizations have a much broader, different role. Yes?
Dr. Johnson, we have time for one more question.
One more question.
In case of tsunami in regions of Thailand and Sri Lanka, the
Yes.
scientists and biologists noticed that the animals had a strange behavior where elephants were moving
yeah.
from the coastal region, and the livestock which were tied, they were very uneasy, and the dogs started barking. So the scientists concluded that the animals can predict the disasters. So I would like to know if there is any further research going on in this regard.
No, that research I read as well. It was the night before a tsunami. Elephants would break through fences to leave the coast, head into the woods, head up into the jungles, into the highlands. Dogs, other animals migrated out of the region. I don't, if there are any zoologists in the room, I don't know the nature of that behavior, but it was observed. I don't think that would be necessarily a reliable predictor. But one very good predictor is if there's seismic activity in the ocean, there's going to be, to some extent, there's going to be a tidal wave. And so the plan now is to regionalize the world on this grid that has seismic monitoring of the large bodies of water around the world so that the earthquake is detected early enough. See, I think it took that wave before it hit Thailand, it took over 10 hours. That's not a lot of time, but that's some time to do some preparation. It hit the coast of Africa the next day. These people had a full day of planning, or could have. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to thank the audience for their participation and Dr. Johnson for this wonderful presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.